Well, I picked this photo today because it might make you wonder, thinking of your life as holy ground. Such a barren place as a desert may not seem like holy ground, may not seem like a place that you would consider as something that is would be welcome in your life at this moment. But my whole attitude toward deserts has changed since we moved to Grand Junction 15 years ago. When we drove in for the first time, I thought it was the most barren place I'd ever seen in my life. It's not the most barren place that I've ever seen in my life, but it's pretty barren until you live here a while and you realize that it's not barren at all. There's life every place. But the photo, of course, is not from Grand Junction, although it could be somewhere in Utah, but I think it's over in the Middle East, over in probably the Sahara, actually, where this story I want to share with you today takes place. But the point of that was that things are not always as they appear, and where sometimes it looks like there's not a whole lot of beauty or anything in the way of an answer where you are at this moment. The idea is to let that go, let that idea go, and realize that the place that you are standing is holy ground or whole ground, that the whole of the universe, the whole of God, the whole of Spirit, whatever you want to call it, is working with you now. And because we are locked into a particular perspective where it doesn't look like it's the answer, or the answer is anywhere near that we're seeking, doesn't mean it's not there. And it's a shift of perception that we undergo. And so the story I want to talk about today involves Moses. I'm going to do a couple of Sundays here on the Old Testament, a couple of the stories out of the Old Testament. But this is where it actually is prior to the Exodus. This is in Moses' early adult life. As you know, the Israelites became enslaved to the Egyptians, but they were not always enslaved to the Egyptians. There was a time when their going to Egypt was solve the problem. It was the answer they were seeking, because the land they lived in was undergoing a famine. And that's a long story I won't get into, involving Joseph and the coat of many colors, all that story. But Joseph preceded his family into Egypt, and when there was famine in the land of the Israelites, they came to Egypt where there was plenty. So Egypt was the answer to the problem at that time. But later on, Egypt became the problem that needed to be solved. And that's an important aspect of this story, just because it happens to all of us. So many times the answer that we get today may be the problem tomorrow. We get into situations that are solved. We get into situations we want an answer, we get the answer, and then we try to stay in that answer. We try to stay in that place. And I would equate that to the chicken embryo and the egg, that is there in this perfect place. The egg is the answer to the way that embryo will develop. It's the perfect environment for quite a while, for 21 days actually. And the chick embryo grows, and pretty soon that answer becomes a problem. And the chick then starts becoming restless. They start peeping. You can actually hear a chick peeping inside the egg before they hatch. And they are developed with an egg tooth. It's a little protrusion on the end of their beak that is designed to get them out of that situation. And then the egg tooth falls off a little bit later. It's just kind of amazing how nature takes care of it, all that kind of stuff. But the point there is the shell, the egg, is the solution. It's that little embryo's world, and it's a perfect world. It has everything that is needed for it to develop and go up to a point. And you can imagine if you're that embryo, that chick, get up to the point where that shell becomes, there's no more elbow room, or I guess wing room, whatever it happens to be. Well, we were all in that situation. We were all born. We were in a womb, and it's exactly the same kind of thing. And the time came when we became restless, and we decided it's time to make a change here. And of course, we pop out and we get spanked, and get bright lights in our eyes and cry and all that stuff. And we wonder if maybe we could go back into that safe environment, as cramped as it was. Anyway, the answer today may be the problem tomorrow, is what I'm saying. So this whole spiritual thing, we have to keep in mind. We're not solving all of our problems from now on. We're not seeking a day where we're going to be enlightened and we're going to have no more issues after that. I told you last week, or sometime I told you, that I used to think that that's what happens. We go along, we study, we pray, we get all the spiritual information we need, and one day we wake up and we have no more problems because we've got it all figured out, we're enlightened. But I think an enlightened being is one who realizes there's never going to be a day where we don't have problems. There's never going to be a time when this doesn't keep going, keep happening. We're going to keep outgrowing the shell. And why is that? Why would that be? Because what is that embryo? What is that living essence in that egg? It's the soul. And it's filling itself out. It's growing. The soul itself is not growing, but the mechanism to carry it is. That is our consciousness. Our experience here on earth, we're always learning, we're always growing. And that never stops. And if you think that, I'm going to learn so much that my life is, I'm never going to have any more problems, then we need to get rid of that thought. It's not that we go around thinking, what's the use? All I'm going to do is have problems. But it's taking the point of view. It's like I've said before, when I write a book, it's a very long process. But what it is, it's a series of problem solving. You never quit solving problems when you write. And then you get it written and you turn over to an editor and they give you a whole list of other problems that you didn't see. And you keep solving those problems until you publish it. And then you publish it, you open the first page and you see a misspelled word. So there's a kind of an ongoing thing there. But it is that's not a negative thing. When I undertake a project like that, I know what I'm getting into. I don't expect the thing to just flow out. We've had that experience, all of us have, of writing something down. We think it's the most brilliant thing we've ever heard in our life. And I find I do this with a book. I'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and have this fantastic idea, which I'll jot down, and wake up the next day and start typing it up. And then a little time passes and I look at that again and it's not so brilliant after all. It just doesn't seem so wonderful after all. But that's not a negative thing. That's part of the living process. It's part of the writing process, but it's part of the living process as well. To say that we will never solve all of our problems, if you solve all your problems, you're probably dead. You're probably not going to be having anything there to challenge you. So it's not a negative thing, and it's not to act as if we have to carry this big burden around all the time of, I'm not going to have my problem solved. But this is a process, and we see this through the Bible. Egypt was the answer, and then it became the problem. And freedom, getting out of Egypt was the answer, and getting out of Egypt became the problem. And then there's one problem after another, through the Exodus, through all that series. It's pretty amazing. They get to the promised land. When you get to the promised land, don't you expect your problems are going to be over? So what they did when they got to the promised land is they encountered giants. And they weren't friendly giants. And 11 of the spies that went into this land to check it out came back and said, we can't do this. These guys are monsters. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, or they see us as grasshoppers. And of course, if you see yourself as a grasshopper, your life's not going to work too well anyway. But the point is, that was the thinking, the promised land. What is that? When Israel got to the promised land, it was just another set of problems. So is that negative? Only if you think, when I get to the promised land, all my problems are going to be solved. It becomes negative. Otherwise, it's a challenge to open our minds to something more. And that's how we have to think about this. We are infinite beings, but our thinking is finite. Our perception of the world is finite. And so that's always going to be growing. If you think about your understanding of God, or I'll speak for myself, if I think of my understanding of God as I was growing up, it's very anthropomorphic, very human. God, the old man up in the sky, that I usually had pretty angry at me for whatever reason, because I was told that's probably how it is. So I started with that because that's what I was raised with, that's what I was given. Not necessarily, my parents didn't sit me down and say that's how it is, because they questioned it too. But I started with that because that was the authority. That was what was given to me by authority. Well, I didn't hang on to that. There came a time when I started reading other things that would challenge that belief. So that's growing up through the egg. It's filling the egg, cracking out, and moving into something else. And so moving out of that particular community, that wasn't the answer. It was just a step in the direction. Because the moment you step into a new way of thinking, a life that represents a new way of thinking, you're stepping into a new beginning where you've got a whole bunch of other things to learn. And it's a never-ending thing, but that's not a bad thing. For every book I've written, I think I can write it better now. And if you don't think that, then what is that? For whatever we've done, don't you, if you could live it over, would you do it better? Would you know more about what to do? And the answer, in all likelihood, is yes. But we're talking here about cycles of reaching peaks, stepping beyond those peaks and starting again. Not at square one, but say square two, but with the same challenge of learning that is involved there. It's interesting that Moses was raised as an Egyptian. You remember the story where his mother, Pharaoh was killing all the children, and his mother snuck him into the Nile River in a basket among the reeds. And actually Pharaoh's daughter discovered him and raised him, and Moses' mother actually was turned out it was his nursemaid, so it worked out pretty well for everybody. But he was raised as an Egyptian, not as a Hebrew in captivity. So he was having a whole different experience, but he saw one of his fellow men being abused by an Egyptian soldier, and he killed that soldier. The Old Testament's full of this kind of stuff. And he had to flee. He had to run away. So later he was forced to flee Egypt and live as a shepherd. But in that period he reconnected with his roots. While in the solitude of the countryside, God spoke to Moses from a burning bush, calling him into service for the task of freeing his people. And I've read where that burning bush was probably an acacia tree. And from the acacia tree, they get a hallucinogenic drug. DMT is called. And I can't pronounce the actual word, but that's this acronym. So some people are trying to say that the visions people would have like this from a burning bush, and it makes sense if he was smoking it, in a burning pipe. I don't know how he was doing it. Maybe it wasn't at all. But it's known that the acacia tree is, and that acacia tree plays quite a role throughout the Old Testament also. It's a very interesting little bit of information. But the suggestion is he went on this psychedelic mind trip and had this vision and all this and that. So, and drugs are used in a lot of the hunter-gatherer ritual types of things, Native American and all that. It's an important part of their religious ceremonies because it opens the mind to a level of experience that is just not available when somebody's in their normal mind. And I'm not advocating hallucinogenic drugs up here, but that's why they use it. It's not, they don't use it as recreational drug. They use it to go into a deeper place in their own being. And there is evidence that many cultures, including the Egyptians, use such things to have these larger experiences. But whatever happened, what he did is he got back to himself, in whatever way you want to think of that. He got back to himself, back to his roots. And this represents back to his spiritual roots. And what that is, it's you and I. We do something, we have a big problem, and we begin to become introspective. We begin to question ourselves. We begin to search our soul. We begin to look at our motivations. We begin to question, how much do I really believe is true? How much of my life do I believe is true? You could think of it as a kind of a midlife crisis, but that's not even really accurate either. You've all had the experience of being pushed up against a wall and not knowing what to do next. And if you have faith, if you have a religious, spiritual faith, you're going to question that. You're going to ask yourself, what is the real here? Does this work? If it works, why isn't it working now? How can I get myself in a place where it shows fruit? In fact, every one of us, whatever faith we have, the time comes when it is absolutely blasted out of the water. We question everything. And it's a very difficult place to be. But it is a very good place to be because we come to ourselves. It's the prodigal son out in the far country. He was so miserable that he came to himself eventually, just starving to death. It's just a story that Jesus made up. But he's talking about us. He's talking about what happens when we hit rock bottom. It's like we question everything because our faith so often is just a series of beliefs that we picked up. Maybe we've read or whatever. But it's put to the test when we're in something here. And Moses was in a situation where his life was in danger. He was being pursued. So he goes off and he becomes a shepherd, and you can just imagine being out in the middle of no place and just kind of thinking about things and kind of rediscovering yourself and your beliefs. And I would imagine he kind of grew up knowing he wasn't an Egyptian. He didn't really fit there. You ever had that feeling? I feel that way on Earth. I think I came in from another planet or something. But I like it here. It's just fine. I'll go back home someday. Moses represents the understanding of God as law, a quantum leap from the view that God is capricious, moody, and completely unpredictable. So that's an important thing in this presentation. God is law, understanding God as law. In other words, when we think of God, we don't think, what do I have to do to put God in a good mood so he'll answer my prayer? That's taking an anthropomorphic view of God. God, this human that I have to get along with and please. As somebody said, prayer is not about overcoming God's reluctance. That's a perception that we have. If we think of God as law, then we're not seeking to change the behavior of God, we're seeking to align ourselves with it. Again, you think of the law of aerodynamics, and you take an airplane that has a wing shaped a certain way that gives that airplane lift. You're not breaking any laws. You're not going against the laws of gravity. You are fulfilling the law of aerodynamics. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. You don't make gravity angry because you're flying an airplane. So we think of God as law, and our life gets out of sorts. Is God punishing me? No, because God is law. If I say 2 and 2 is 5, I get the wrong answer. Is the law of mathematics punishing me? Or have I just come up with the wrong answer? There's no law of wrong answers in the law of mathematics. I don't have to apologize, but I have to suffer the consequences of my own mistakes. So the good news is I can correct that. And I don't have to appease somebody or offer a sacrifice. That's the whole thing that sacrifice was centered around, is why do you offer sacrifice? To appease an angry God. Why do you throw a virgin into a volcano? Because the volcano has this human personality, and if I appease that, then I'll be okay. We've thought that for ages, and we think it today. If I tithe, I'll appease the angry God, and he'll fill me. I'll find a Ferrari in my driveway in the morning. We think that if we take certain actions that will appease the God, that our life will go better. So we think if God is law, we say, okay, let's get that off the table. That's not true. We're not trying to appease anybody. We're trying to work with the law. And that's, as I pointed out, what the word for prayer, slotha, the Aramaic root or word for prayer is slotha, which means to make an adjustment. And one of the adjustments I make is I'm not trying to make happy an angry God, or one that I've offended because of my actions. I'm understanding that, okay, I've set some things in motion by the way I think, by the way I feel, by the way I perceive things. I've created a reality that's probably not true, and so I try to get this God to come in and help me change that reality. Well, don't do that. It has nothing to do with God in that regard, in terms of changing something I've done or forgiving me or whatever. I'm dealing with law, the law of mathematics. I don't have to ask the law of mathematics to forgive me for coming up with 2 and 2 is 5. But I do have to work the formula correctly, come up with 4, get the right answer. So I make an adjustment. I adjust my thinking to something's not working here, and I want it to work, and I know it will because it's law. That's the way we think of God in this regard, and that's not a cold-hearted diversion. There's nothing wrong with thinking of God in human terms if we understand what we're doing. It's like the little girl that wanted to pray to a God with skin, just to feel that she was close. And sometimes we have to give up, if we're being asked to throw out our whole past understanding of God. Well, sometimes it's okay, as even Emily Cady talked about this in her book, Lessons in Truth, that don't worry about being too orthodox when you pray. Don't worry about asking God in a very human way for help. What we're doing when we do that is we're opening our minds to something higher than where we are at this moment. But we need to also bear in mind that we're not changing, seeking to appease or change the behavior of God. We're dealing with God as law, and there's a lot more comfort there than you might think. So affirmative prayer, somebody said, think of affirmative prayer as the act of setting certain mental and emotional conditions that make a specific outcome inevitable. So that's law. If we are holding, say you're in a situation where you feel like you're just, your back is against the wall, so your prayer becomes affirmative. Instead of saying, I don't know what to do, I'm scared to death, I don't have enough to deal with this. What is affirmative prayer? It's pulling your mind to the place of saying something like, okay, I don't know what to do right now, but something in me does. We're starting to make a change. Something in me is working out through me at this very moment. So I'm setting up a mental state, and then I add to the emotion, how would I feel if I had this solution here? How would I feel if this had worked out? And I begin to get that feeling, because what I was doing previously was imagining how I would feel if the whole thing blew up. What if the very worst thing happens? That's how I was feeling. And I know exactly how that feels. At least I know how I perceive that it would feel if it happened. So we've all been through those things, and we know what it is to let our thoughts and our emotions run away from us, so we catch that. God is law. We set up a new scenario in our thought and in our emotion. Affirmative prayer is the act of setting certain mental and emotional conditions that make a specific outcome inevitable. And as I say all the time, whatever that specific outcome is that you want, just say this or something better. Because so often, it's not what we think, the best answer is not always what we think it should be. So say this or something better. We're opening ourselves to infinite intelligence. I don't have all the answers, so I'm sitting here racking my brain trying to come up with the answers. Say this or something better. You're opening yourself to the something better. But it could be this. It could be the thing that you're imagining. But the point here is affirmative prayer is shifting your thought into, when you think about a problem, you're worried about it, and your mind, your mental side is going all over the board there, and you're emotionally distraught. And it's real easy to let things take you away. It can happen in a flash, and it does. And something happens, we start down that road, and we just keep thinking about it and keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger. So prayer is to make an adjustment. Let's adjust our mind back, because God is law. Let's set ourselves up to represent mentally and emotionally a condition we want to see expressed. That's what we're doing. God's will for the Hebrew people was the condition of prosperity and absolute freedom. If you recall this, God appearing to the angel of the Lord appearing to Abraham way back when this promise of the promised land was made. He had Abraham look out, and as far as he could see, that was the freedom. That was the land that was theirs, the promised land. And don't you have that same feeling? Don't you have the feeling that there's something that could happen through you, that it's a vision for how your life can be? I've carried something like that since I can remember. Early, when I was little, I dreamed of all the wonderful things I do. And it's a natural thing. We carry this vision of life as freedom. It's Abraham looking out as far in every direction as he can see, and the Lord saying, "This is yours." But in fact, at that moment, it wasn't his. And that's kind of where we are. We carry this larger picture, but it's not manifested. It's not part of our experience. It's the promise. But God's will for the Hebrew people was the condition of prosperity and absolute freedom. It goes clear back to that Abraham day. It was the understanding of God as law that brought them out of captivity into the land of plenty. And that's ultimately what happened. But it was Moses, the understanding of God as law. And we're not talking about Moses, we're talking about you, we're talking about me. Our understanding of God as law, whatever captivity you are in at this moment, you begin to visualize and to feel not where it looks like you are, but where you need to be, where you want to be. What greater good is now unfolding here? So I'm baffled with what's going on, okay? I don't have to know the answer. But because I'm dealing with law, I know the answer that is for my best and highest good is now unfolding. So I don't pay so much attention, as Jesus said, don't judge by appearances. It's very easy to do, and we all do it, and we're not going to quit doing it anytime soon, but we can do it and then stop, catch ourselves, remind ourselves, make an adjustment. So it was the understanding of God as law, Moses, that brought them out of the captivity into the promised land. We may be waiting for God to act and bring about our freedom. The voice of God reminded Moses that the place upon which he stood was holy ground. And that's really a critical point. That so often, I mean, if you are miserable right now, if you're in some thing that's going on that you just don't know what to do, and you feel totally taken back by it. So what you want to have happen is whatever it is that'll resolve that. It's very important, even in your worst moments, the mystics would call it the dark night of the soul. Those moments where you don't know what to do, you're still okay. That's a place of power. And that's where we want to start. That, okay, I don't know what to do here, but the answer is now unfolding. And why is that? Because this universe will never stop working fully just because you've got a problem. It's still working. And all that you want, that thing that's in you, that infinite aspect of you that's pushing out, knows how to come out. It knows how to express. It knows how to get you past this appearance. And sometimes those appearances can be very convincing. Well, they almost always are. But look at yourself now and think of all those you've been through. How many times you thought maybe you couldn't make it, and you did. Sometimes it's helpful just to remember those things. If you can. You know, when you're going through it, it seems like it'll never end and you'll never forget it, but once it's over, it's like, it's gone. It's hard to remember sometimes. And that's not a bad thing. But the voice of God reminded Moses that the place upon which he stood was holy ground, and that's what is true of us. Whatever condition your life is in right now, this is it. And when I say that, I'm not saying that you're going to stay here forever in this place, but you are in the perfect place now, the only place you can ever be, to open yourself to the next step, to move on to the next step. But if we're locked into the appearances, we suffer. We suffer in that moment. We're the Israelites making bricks for the Egyptians, you know, doing absolute mindless labor of worry and fear and going through all these things that do nothing for our benefit. You and I now stand in the fully active kingdom of God. Dwell on what you want, expecting it to come about, this or something better, and you will begin to see a positive change for the better. And that positive change you see is in you first. Happens in you first. And what I find is if I'm worried about something and I reach that point in myself where I'm okay with whatever the outcome is, I have found my center of strength, my center of power. And things work out in some way. Usually not like a big lightning bolt from the sky in some miraculous way. It's usually just some simple outworking of things. And the next thing I know, the problem is solved. All right? So next week, we'll talk about Moses again. Thank you for coming out. We'll see you then.